I need to tell you something I've never told anyone outside of my daughter and my attorney. And I want to be clear from the start that I'm not proud of every decision I made. But I am alive. I still have my home, my savings, and my peace of mind. And the only reason any of that is still mine is because of one small thing I held back when I should have been open. I was 63 years old when I met her. My late wife, Joanne, had passed 18 months before. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We were married 31 years. I'm not going to talk much about that loss, because it's not what this story is about. But you need to understand the shape of the grief I was carrying when everything else happened. It wasn't the dramatic kind of grief you see in movies. It was the quiet, suffocating kind. The kind where you wake up at 5 in the morning and reach across the bed out of habit. And then you remember, and the whole day collapses before it even starts. My daughter, she lives about 40 minutes from me in Decatur, Georgia. She kept checking in. She'd call me every couple of days, stop by on Sundays with her kids. I could tell she was worried. She'd look at me with this expression she probably didn't know I noticed, like she was watching something slow motion that she couldn't stop. I was functional, I was eating, I was keeping the house clean, but I wasn't really there, and she could see that. What I did not tell her, what I did not tell anyone, was that I had already started attending a small grief support group at the church I'd been going to for 20 years. I only went because the pastor suggested it, and I didn't know how to say no to him. 3 Tuesdays in a row, I sat in a folding chair in the fellowship hall and mostly just listened to other people talk. I wasn't ready to say much myself. The 4th Tuesday, she was there. Her name was Margot. She was 60, she said, though she looked younger. Trim, well-dressed, soft-spoken. She said she'd lost her husband to a stroke about 2 years prior. She laughed a little when she told it. Not at his death, but at herself, at how long she'd been stuck. She said, "I thought I'd be over this by now, and here I am still talking to strangers about it." The room laughed gently. I laughed too. That was the first time I had laughed in 4 months. I want to be honest here, because this story doesn't work if I'm not. I know what I was. I was lonely. I was 63 years old, and I had this house, a 4-bedroom house, that Joanne and I had owned outright since 2011, and 2 rental properties in the same county that I'd been building toward for 20 years, and a retirement account that was solid, and I was rattling around all of it by myself. That kind of loneliness has a weight to it. It presses on your chest. And Margot was warm, and she laughed at the right things, and she asked me questions about my life, like she actually wanted to know the answers. We started talking after the meetings. Then we started getting coffee after the meetings. Then one Thursday she called me. I hadn't given her my number. The group coordinator had passed it along, which I thought was slightly odd, but didn't dwell on, and asked if I wanted to try the new soul food place on Flat Shoals. I said yes. Here's where I need to tell you about the thing I didn't say. About 2 months into knowing Margot, maybe 5 or 6 dates in, we were at dinner, and she asked me what I did for work. I'd retired 3 years earlier from a career in commercial real estate, but I still managed my rental properties directly. I handled the maintenance calls, the lease renewals, the tenant relationships. It kept me busy and it kept money coming in. But I told her I was semi-retired and doing some consulting work here and there. I did not tell her about the rental properties. I did not tell her about the equity in my home or the specifics of my retirement account. I said I was comfortable and left it at that. I want to be clear. I did not do this with any plan or scheme in my head. I did it because Joanne and I had learned that lesson the hard way in our 30s. When people we thought were our friends started treating us differently after we bought our second property. When money becomes visible, relationships change. I had just absorbed that as a truth about the world. Keep the financial details private until you know who you're really dealing with. It wasn't a trap I was setting for Margot, it was just how I moved. The relationship moved fast. I know that now. I couldn't see it at the time because fast felt like warmth, and warmth was what I needed so badly. By month 4, we were talking seriously about the future. By month 7, she had a drawer at my house. By month 9, she had suggested gently that it might make more sense for her to just stay here full time, since she was renting an apartment and we were spending every night together anyway. I said, let's get engaged first. She said yes, before I finished the sentence. My daughter came over for dinner 2 nights later and I told her. She put down her fork. She picked it back up. She said, Dad, you've known her for 9 months. I know, I said. That's not very long. I know that too. She didn't yell. She wasn't cruel about it. She just said quietly, I hope you know what you're doing. And then we finished dinner and she helped me with the dishes. And she hugged me goodnight, and I could feel her holding on a little longer than usual. I should have listened. I knew it then, and I know it now. But I thought I understood Margot. I thought grief had given me some kind of clarity about what mattered and who was real. The wedding was small. Margot had a son, he was 32, and she had a sister who flew in from Indianapolis. I had my daughter and her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and my old friend from work, who I'll just call my best friend because he's been in my corner for 30 years. The ceremony was at the church. The reception was at a restaurant nearby. It was a Friday evening in March. I remember the dogwoods were just starting to come in. That night, back at the house, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not joy exactly. More like relief, like maybe the worst of it was behind me and something was beginning again. I woke up Saturday morning and Margot was already in the kitchen. She had her laptop open on the kitchen table. She looked up when I came in and smiled. Morning, she said. I kissed her on the cheek and poured myself coffee and sat across from her. She turned the laptop around to face me. On the screen was a Zillow listing. A house. New construction, up in Woodstock, about 35 miles north of where we were sitting. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, 2-car garage. The listing price was in the upper 400,000s, she said. I was thinking we should look at this one this weekend. I stared at the screen. I said, we just got married yesterday. She said, I know, but the market moves fast. And this neighborhood has a good school district. I said, for what? Our grandchildren don't live in Woodstock. She said, my son has been thinking about starting a family. If we're close by. I set my coffee mug down. I said, Margot, I own this house. We're sitting in it right now. Why would we buy a new house in Woodstock? She said, this place is nice, but it's really more of a bachelor's house. I was thinking we could sell it and use the equity as a down payment on something that feels like ours together. I looked at her. I looked at this woman I had married 16 hours ago. I said, this house has been in my family for over a decade. It's paid off. Why would I sell a paid-off house to take on a mortgage? She said, because starting fresh together means something. This house has a lot of history that isn't mine. She said it gently, but I heard what was underneath it. This house has value that I haven't touched yet. I said I needed to think. I went outside and walked around the backyard for a while. The dogwoods were out there too. 3 of them that Joanne had planted the year we paid off the mortgage. I stood there, looking at them. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my best friend, just checking in on the newlyweds. I stared at it for a long time, and then I put my phone back in my pocket. The rest of Saturday was quiet, in the way that a house gets quiet when 2 people are being careful around each other. We made dinner together. We watched television. She went to bed before me, and when I came in, she was already asleep. Sunday morning, she brought it back up. This time it wasn't the Zillow listing. This time it was a different conversation, and it was her son who was in it. He had driven down from Marietta and was sitting in my living room, his feet on the floor, not quite looking at me directly, and Margot was talking about finances. She said that since we were married now, it would make sense to consolidate. She used that word specifically. Consolidate. She said her son needed some help getting stabilized. He'd had some business setbacks. She said, nothing dramatic, just a rough patch. And she thought that maybe if I could co-sign on a small business loan with him, just to get him started, it would mean the world. Her son looked at me then. He didn't say thank you or please or even really acknowledge what was being asked. He just looked at me with this flat, waiting expression, like this was a formality, and I was taking too long completing it. I said, I'm not going to co-sign a loan for someone I've known for 9 months. Margot said, he's family now. I said, family is built over time, not overnight. Her son stood up. He said, you know what, never mind. He said it to his mother, not to me, like I wasn't in the room, like I was an obstacle they were working around. After he left, Margot said, you embarrassed him. I said, I protected myself. She said, is that how you see this marriage? As something you need protection from? That night I called my daughter. I didn't tell her what was happening. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. And I also didn't want her to say I told you so, even though she would have had every right. I just said I wanted to see the grandkids, and could we do brunch tomorrow? She said of course, and I could hear in her voice that she knew something was wrong, but she didn't push. Monday morning, Margot came downstairs while I was drinking my coffee, and she sat across from me and she said she wanted to talk about what she called our financial picture. She had a notepad. I remember the notepad specifically because it had a rooster on it, which Joanne had bought at a craft fair about 10 years ago, and seeing Margot sitting there with Joanne's notepad open in front of her did something to me that I can't fully explain. It wasn't anger, it was more like clarity. She started talking. She said that since we were legally married, it was important to be transparent with each other. She said she wanted to know the full picture of my assets. She said she had a right to know what she'd married into. She used that phrase, what she'd married into. I said, what do you mean by assets? She said, your properties, your accounts. I'd like to understand the full scope. I said, what properties? She said, the rental properties. I know you have them. I went very still. I said, how do you know about those? She said she'd done some research. She said it in a matter-of-fact tone, like that was a normal thing. Like, of course, a woman does a public records search on a man she's been dating for 9 months before she marries him. Maybe it is normal. But what it told me was that she had known for some time what I had, and she had still let me believe she didn't. And here's the thing. Here's the part I've gone back to 100 times since. Because I had never told her, she didn't know the details. She knew I had rental properties from the county records, but she didn't know the income they generated. She didn't know about the separate LLC I'd set up to hold them. She didn't know about the revocable trust I'd established 4 years ago that my attorney had structured specifically to protect those assets. She had a number from a property search, and she thought she had the whole picture. She didn't. I said very calmly, Margot, I think we have a problem. She said, what kind of problem? I said, the kind that I need to talk to my attorney about before we go any further. She said, your attorney? Why would you need your attorney? I said, because you just told me you researched my assets before we married and didn't tell me. And now you're asking me for financial disclosure 2 days after our wedding. That's not a conversation. That's a negotiation. She said, I just want us to be honest with each other. I said, so do I, starting now. I called my attorney that afternoon. He'd been handling my real estate matters for 11 years. I told him everything. The timeline, the conversations, the loan request for the son, the notepad, all of it. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said, the trust is solid. She can't touch what's in there. And the LLC creates separation on the properties. She married you, not the entity. He said there were some steps we should take given the circumstances. Amendments, documentation, clarity on what was individual property versus marital. He said I should not transfer anything, sign anything, or co-sign anything without his review. I said I understood. I went home that evening and Margot was in the kitchen again. But this time she wasn't looking at houses. She was on the phone, and she lowered her voice when I walked in, and I had that feeling again, that slow, cold clarity that had been settling in me since Sunday morning. She came into the living room after and sat down and said we needed to talk about what I'd said earlier about my attorney. She said that felt adversarial. She said marriage shouldn't feel like a legal arrangement. I said, what happened to honesty? She said, I am being honest. I said, you researched my property records before we got married. You knew about the rentals. You didn't tell me you knew. How is that honest? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping into something complicated. I said, and what did you find? She said, that you're more comfortable than you let on. I said, and what did you plan to do with that information? She didn't answer, and that non-answer told me everything I needed to know about what this had been. I called my daughter the next morning. This time I told her everything. I sat at my kitchen table and I talked for almost 45 minutes straight while she listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a second. Then she said, Dad, I need you to call your attorney again today, and I need you to not make any financial decisions until you do. She didn't say I told you so, not once. I've never loved her more than I did in that moment. My attorney and I met in his office 2 days later. He walked me through exactly where things stood. Because the rental properties were held inside the LLC, which had been established years before the marriage, and because the trust was structured the way it was, Margot had far less legal claim than she likely believed. The marital home was more complex. It was in my name, but she now had rights as a spouse. And he advised me to begin documenting the conversations I'd had and to keep careful records going forward. He also said gently that if I was considering separation, sooner was generally better than later when it came to protecting assets. He didn't push me toward anything. He just laid out the landscape. I drove home slowly. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while, just looking at the house, at the dogwoods. At the front door, Joanne and I had painted red the summer before she got sick. Margot met me at the door. She said she'd made dinner. She acted like the last 4 days hadn't happened. She was warm, she was soft-spoken, she asked about my meeting. She said she hoped we could get back to a good place. I sat down at the table. I ate the dinner. I was polite. And the whole time, I was thinking about what my attorney had said about documentation, about timing, about what it means to protect something you've built over decades. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved quietly and carefully. I spoke to my attorney regularly. I did not transfer anything. I did not sign anything. I was cordial with Margot, but I was not open, and I could see that she felt the shift even if she didn't name it. She kept circling back to the financial conversation. She brought up her son twice more. She asked once, casually, if I had a will and who was the beneficiary. That was the moment I knew for certain. Not that I doubted it before, but that question asked that casually, that soon. That was the moment there was nothing left to wonder about. I had a conversation with her on a Thursday evening. I told her that I had spoken with my attorney extensively, that I understood the legal situation clearly, and that I believed we had entered this marriage under very different assumptions about what it was and what it meant. I told her that I was willing to work through a separation agreement that was fair and reasonable, that I wasn't interested in dragging anything through the courts, but that I needed her to understand I was not willing to compromise the financial security I had spent 30 years building. She said, "You set me up." I said, "I didn't tell you everything about my finances." "That's true. You didn't tell me everything about yours either, or about your intentions. We both held things back. The difference is what we were holding them back for." She left within the week. Her son came with a truck on a Saturday afternoon, and they packed her things and they left. He didn't look at me. She hugged me at the door, which surprised me. It was a brief hug. I don't know what it meant. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just a habit. My daughter came over that evening, and we sat on the back porch, and she brought a pie from the bakery she likes. And we didn't talk about Margot much. We talked about the grandkids, we talked about the dogwoods. She said she thought they needed to be trimmed back a little this year. I said I'd look into it. Before she left, she stopped at the door and turned back and said, "I'm glad you're okay, Dad." I said, "Me too." What I've thought about most in the months since is not the anger. The anger faded pretty fast. What I've thought about is the grief, and how grief makes you porous in a way that you can't fully defend against. How it opens you up to warmth that might not be what it appears. I'm not saying every person who comes into your life when you're hurting is there to take something from you. I don't believe that. I've met good people. I know what genuine kindness looks like. But I know this too. When you're 63 years old and you've built something real over a lifetime, it's not paranoia to be thoughtful about who you let inside it. It's not coldness. It's not disrespect to someone who might be genuine. It's just wisdom. The hard kind, the kind that costs something before you have it. I still go to church. I still see my daughter every Sunday. My best friend and I play golf on Saturday mornings when his knees cooperate, which is less and less often, but we still go. I still walk around the backyard in the evening sometimes and look at the dogwoods. Joanne planted those trees the year we paid off this house. She said she wanted something that bloomed every spring to remind us that we'd done something worth doing. They bloomed again this April. I stood there in the yard by myself and watched the light come through them, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy exactly, not yet, but the quiet, solid feeling of a man who still has everything he worked for and knows it and doesn't take it lightly. That's enough for now. That's more than enough.